Hey everyone, it is always good to be on here with you guys and to have this opportunity. I was just thinking, I know we've all been talking and hearing about how I think beginning of March was kind of the 1 year mark with all this COVID stuff. And I know for us at Zion, that marks a year that we have been gathering this way, which is kind of crazy. To think that a year has already come and gone since we have gathered together in the sanctuary, it's really even hard to wrap your mind around that. But very grateful for being able to do our time together like this. But I know all of us are anxious to see each other in person again, and hopefully with this warm weather, that will be coming soon. The changes with the status of COVID across the world, that's always exciting as we see that things are finally starting to improve. It's kind of neat how it's happening in conjunction with spring. I keep looking outside because we have a window right here and I just see kind of evidence of spring. So anyway, I always feel compelled to do this because I know the amount of work that goes into these things, but Matt and my dad, to think that you guys have been keeping up with this since last March is incredible. I've only jumped in a couple times, but for those of you watching these at home, there's a lot that goes into them, especially I would imagine in the Weaver house when they are coordinating little people and their involvement, and you guys make it look so seamless and amazing. So big kudos to you guys for pulling that off. It's amazing. So anyway, I'm going to jump in here to this series that my dad and Matt have been doing on the letters of John. And we're going to be looking in 1 John chapter 5. And I know my dad talked about this early on, and it's come up before since then. Just that John, he really likes to repeat things and come at the same thing from a slightly different angle. And I thought it was kind of funny during my preparation. In one of the commentaries, there was a quote that I thought captured it well. They said, themes, speaking of John's writing, themes are repeating and double repeating. John is producing variations on what he's already said, and then variations on the variations. And that is very true. When they passed along the passage that was next up, I started reading it, and there was a part of me that's like, okay, well, what new thing can we pull out from this? Because a lot of what he talks about is what he has been talking about and stuff that Matt and my dad have covered so well and thoroughly. But I do think there's certainly a portion of this that we can look at in a new way that we will go ahead and take a look at today. A lot of if you think like broad themes, broad topics, obedience and love have been very central with what John talks about. And there's a third topic which kind of takes front and center in this chapter, and that is the topic of faith. And so that's where we're going to head today. I'm going to read, probably not the entire passage. 1 John 5, 1 through 12 is the passage I'm focusing on, but specifically the first part. I'm just going to read the first 5 verses. So starting in chapter 5, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. There's some of his repetition. And his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? Now the passage continues, and I'll touch a little bit later on what the rest of these verses talk about. But I'm just going to stop there because there's something right there in the first few verses that I think we're going to find interesting today, and is kind of a new focus for John. And that can be found in verse 4. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? This idea of overcoming the world, that hasn't really popped up too much so far. You see it come up in John's Gospel a couple times, but as far as his letter here, this is kind of a new thing. And when I was doing some of the reading, one of the writers, they said that. They're like, you're reading along, you're hearing a lot of the same language, talking about the commandments and children of God and things that you've heard in the previous sermons. It's like, and then all of a sudden you get this phrase, overcome the world, or overcoming the world. And that hits you as a new phrase that you haven't heard as much. So that's where we're going to sit today. That's what we're going to talk about. So let's unpack that just a little bit further. The premise to this, the premise is everyone born of God. If you were to look at the passage again, it says at the beginning, the very beginning, in verse 5, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God. So right there you get that phrase, born of God. And then if you were to look down in verse 4, it says, for everyone who has been born of God. So let's just first take a look at that, because that's the premise. Before we even get to the overcoming the world, the question is this idea of everyone born of God. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? And just kind of a neat way to think of it is everyone born of God has been incorporated into God's family. We've talked about, and whether in this series or other sermons, we talk about this idea of how we are all adopted by God and how just that's such a neat and redemptive concept. And so, we've been incorporated into God's family, and as a result of that, and what is laid out in the first couple verses of this section, there are certain things that naturally result from that. So in terms of being incorporated into God's family, that should result in belief in Jesus. It should result in loving God and loving the children of God. And it should also result in keeping his commandments. And those are the things that are laid out in the first 3 verses. So, incorporated into God's family should result in belief in Jesus, loving God, loving the children of God, and keeping his commandments. And then one more thing is added, and that's where we find that phrase, overcoming the world. And for those born of God, for everyone who has been born of God, overcomes the world. So, again, this born of God thing, there were 2 quotes that I found helpful in terms of my understanding of, okay, what is that? What's the significance of that? What is it? How does that link? The first one was, it is not the man, but his birth from God, which conquers. So it's not saying that we, on our own power, with our own might, our own abilities, our own strength, that we conquer the world, that we overcome the world. But rather, it's our birth from God that overcomes. That's an important distinction there. So it's not the man or the woman. It's the fact that we are born of God. That fact is what ultimately overcomes the world. The other quote is, our being born of God is God's act on our behalf. So being born of God, it's God's act on our behalf, the event through which he moves to overcome the world. I'll read that one more time, and then we'll keep moving. Our being born of God is God's act on our behalf, the event through which he moves to overcome the world. So still, if you're like I am, as I was reading through this, I'm still like, okay, well, what's what connects it? What's the key to this process in terms of being born of God? And yes, it's our birth from God that conquers the world or overcomes the world. But what actually completes that process? And then he goes on very clearly, and he states later in verse 4, I know I keep reading this over and over again, as if John wasn't already repetitive, and now I'm just being even more. But for everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. So our faith is the key piece there. The key piece in this process of overcoming the world, having been born by God and overcoming the world, that piece that kind of fits in the middle, connecting those two, would be our faith. The amazing thing, and I know we've talked about this, and I don't think we can ever talk about it too much, but the amazing thing to remember is that Jesus has already overcome and conquered the world. That's talked about. John talks about that in his gospel. He has overcome. That was done on the cross. That was done through his earthly ministry, the cross, his death and resurrection. And so the victory over the world has already taken place. So he has already overcome. He has already conquered the world, the evils of the world, the sin of the world, all of those things. So it is our faith in him and the victory that has already been had that allows us to overcome the world. Okay, so that's in terms of our faith, is our faith in who Jesus was, our faith in what he did, and our faith in the victory that he had is really what enables us to overcome the world. Another way to think about it, and we get to ride on Jesus' coattails. Jesus did all the hard work. He did all the heavy lifting. He secured the victory, and we get to benefit from that. Now, just as an aside, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but to make sure I touch on the other part of this passage, verses 6 through 12. Again, I'm not going to explore these fully, but they talk about the testimony of Jesus. They talk about the things that testify to who he was and what he did. And John specifically mentions how the water testifies to Jesus, the blood, and the Spirit. And that these three things provide testimony of who Jesus was and his victory. Now, you can spend a lot of time kind of dissecting, okay, well, what does the water represent? What does the blood represent? And the Spirit? A lot of what I've read, the water was linked to Jesus' baptism. The blood was linked to his death on the cross. And then, of course, the Spirit speaks for itself, kind of. Others were saying that the blood and the water represented when Jesus was pierced on the cross. And it represents the flesh. And it represents something else that John has talked about how, Jesus came in the flesh. And again, I'm not going to try and hash that out. But the point here is, in Jewish culture, in order for a testimony or something to be considered true, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses. There had to be 2 or 3 to testify toward it. So much of what I was reading was saying it's not any accident here that John is citing 3 different things that testify to who Jesus was and his ministry and his victory, because there was something very significant in that culture about having 2 or 3 testify. So that's just kind of cool. And how that links to what I was talking about is that the second half of this passage kind of provides the foundation for our faith. So the faith that is being called for and referenced in the first few verses, it then goes on to say, and here is why we can have this faith. Here are the reasons why this faith is secure, and the assurance to our faith. So that's how those later verses link up with the first one, or one way that they link in. And again, I'm not going to explore them too much further than that, but I did want to mention that. So back to this topic of faith, okay? So we just have faith in Jesus and his victory, and we overcome the world, right? It sounds easy. It sounds like it should just be very simple, and that we should just have no problem in our day-to-day life overcoming the world. But I think all of us would very quickly say that it's not that easy, and it's not that simple, and that there are many times that we feel that the world has overcome us more than we have overcome the world. So we're going to circle back to that a little bit, but just kind of keep that in your mind for a moment. I want to take the phrase itself, to overcome the world, and just very briefly kind of define what those terms would have meant or been understood to mean. So this idea to overcome, in some translations or some versions of the Bible, it says to conquer. The Greek meaning, and I love this first one that I came across. It wasn't the very first one, but it was the one that, the definition that was used in reference to this passage. The Greek meaning of to overcome, it's by the force which resides in goodness. So to overcome by the force that resides in goodness. I think that's so cool. I love that. This idea that there is actually like a force in goodness, an overcoming power in goodness. And, it's not talking about salvation from goodness or anything like that. We're talking goodness when we're talking, fruit of the Spirit and things like that, that there is a force to that, and a force that can overcome the world. So that was one definition that I came across. The ESV paraphrased it a little differently. They said that this idea of to overcome the world, it's not being defeated by the world's hostility or compelled by it to turn from Christ. So not being defeated by the world's hostility or compelled by it to turn from Christ. Now, as far as what the world is referring to, we kind of use that generally. And it's interesting because I think it was just Matt's last sermon that talked about loving the world, and now we're talking about overcoming the world. And so even that phrase, the world, can be used in different contexts to refer to slightly different aspects of the world. But in this regard, there's kind of a specific way of looking at it and then a little bit more of a broad way. And the specific way, when we refer to the world, is the incentives or temptations to sin that exist in the world. So, yeah, as simple as that. And I think most of us could think of what some of those things often are. So the incentives to sin that exist in the world. But a little bit more of a kind of zoomed out, broad view of it would be the obstacles to God's cause. So referring to the world. So overcoming the world can be thought of as overcoming the incentives to sin that exist in the world. Or it can also be thought of overcoming the obstacles to God's cause. And both are true, and it's not to say it has to be one or the other. It's just kind of two ways of looking at the same thing. And I think we can relate to that. At this point, I think we can relate to, there is hostility in the world, and there are things that often compel people to turn away from God, or there are obstacles to God's cause. And the thought that they need to be overcome makes total sense. I don't think any of us struggle with that. But where the struggle comes is, how does this actually look in our day-to-day lives? Because I don't know about you, but I have felt overwhelmed, overcome by the hostility of the world just in the last month, where the hostility that we sometimes encounter, sometimes specifically because we are believers, but also just because of the hostility that exists in the world, it can be really overwhelming. And the incentives to sin can be very gripping. And so it's not really simple or easy. In some ways, it feels like a tall order. And we can easily get discouraged in this. As I said earlier, it can often feel like we get overcome by the world far more than we overcome the world. But the thing we have to remember, and we always have to come back to, is that Jesus has already overcome it. And that's like what we grab hold of. When the discouragement comes, when the temptations come, that has to be the thing that is always there to kind of quiet us, that Jesus has overcome this. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easier in that moment, but we have that assurance, and our faith in him and what he has done should really kind of anchor us in those times. So Jesus has already overcome it. We are living from a position of victory. And our faith is in who Jesus is, and what he did, and the work of what he did, what that means for us today. Now, as we are kind of taking this in a more practical direction here, I'm going to focus in on an aspect of this that John doesn't really spell out in his text, in his passage here, but it's a biblical principle that I think it applies, and I think it is also, it's key to this process of walking this out in a day-to-day way. I'm going to step aside from the passage for a moment and just tell you briefly about a couple recent things happening in our house. And the kids right now, I'm going to specifically talk about Anna and Asher. Easton's lots of fun, but his stories don't quite apply as much. They're sponges. They are such sponges right now. I mean, I know all kids are, but like I feel like they both in different ways are just such sponges. And I'm really seeing this in just little things. Anna is mimicking everything. Like she just mimics, and she just, like I said, she's a sponge, and then it just comes out. And like something as small as, I don't know how many of you have seen Cars, and the movie, I don't even know where exactly it happens in there, but there's a part where I think it's Lightning McQueen who says it. Either he's passing somebody in a race or someone's trying to pass him, and he's like, he says, "Not today, old man." Okay? So I think it was to an older race car. He says, "Not today, old man." Well, Asher's the one who loves Cars. Anna hasn't even watched it all that much, but she has just grabbed a hold of this phrase. And she says it all the time, which it's like, it's not the phrase you want her to say at the wrong place to the wrong person, but it is also hysterical. So like she'll be walking through her house and Aaron will be like, "Hey, Anna, could you let Copper out? Could you let the dog out?" And she'll just be like, "Not today, old man." And she'll just like keep walking. And now a lot of times, to her credit, she loves to let the dog out. She's usually very helpful. But her timing with this phrase is hysterical. Like she just says it, whenever she's in the mood and we ask her to do something. "Not today, old man." And it's like she won't even turn around and look at you. She just says it as she keeps moving. But, that's just something she picked up out of nowhere. She's really in this, like, with her hair and clothes and stuff. Like, I'll say, like, "Anna, you want to put your hair in a ponytail today?" She'll be like, "Well, are you wearing a ponytail?" Or, like, as we're talking about clothes, she's always like, "Well, what are you wearing, Mommy?" She really wants to just follow along with whatever it is that I'm doing. And it's, super cute. I'm sure that will eventually change. But the other thing that she has been doing is she has decided she's now having online meetings. And we have this little iPad that has a keyboard that connects to it. And she has online meetings. She'll like pull it out and she'll be like, "Mommy, I have an online meeting right now." And she'll open it and she'll start like hitting the keys. And she'll hit, like, she'll use lingo from what she has heard as Aaron and I have had online Zoom sessions here at home. And she'll be like, "Oh," she's like, "I forgot to unmute." And then she'll like unmute. I mean, it's hysterical, but she's just absorbing everything. Asher, he is really observing, processing, like taking in so much right now. And an example of that, Aaron and I had a recent disagreement. And the kids were around for part of those discussions. And after a day or two, I was driving Asher to school, and he's just like, he just was very like tuned into what was happening. And he asked me extensive questions about our disagreement and what it was really about. And at that point, it was resolved. And he's like, "Well, how did you resolve it? What do you guys talk about? And did you apologize? Did Daddy apologize? Who apologized first?" Like all of these things. And then this was a disagreement that did span more than one day. And he said, he's like, "Well, Mommy, shouldn't you guys have not gone to sleep angry?" And I was like, "Yes, you're right, Asher. We shouldn't have." And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "I mean, when Anna and I fight," he's like, "we're done in like 2 minutes." And I was like, "Well, that is much better than probably how long our little disagreement took." But he's just like absorbing and processing and looking at what we're doing and looking at how we're handling things. And he's really trying to understand. Even I thought about this the other day at my parents' house, and my parents probably remember this, but we were talking about a couple different things, and it wasn't all that serious, but it wasn't stuff that kids would usually be interested in. And he just sat there for like 45 minutes and was hanging on every word. And a couple times I'm like, "Asher, just go out to the van with Anna and Easton." I said, "They're watching a video." And he's like, "No." And he didn't say anything. He just like sat there listening. He's just really engaged with stuff like that. And the point here, they will always be watching how and if we overcome the world. They will largely learn how to overcome the world by what they see in us. they're going to watch, they're going to be watching and learning from how we walk out our faith in Jesus and how we face the challenges in the world, and how our faith in his victory impacts how we walk through those challenges. So on one hand, that's kind of an overwhelming reality, but on the other hand, it's also kind of exciting because we have an opportunity to display that. But the reality is, this isn't just about children. Like, we all are like this, and we all need this. My point is, we overcome the world together. And that's kind of where I wanted to land with this, that we overcome the world together. You think about the examples that we have to follow. Here I was talking about kids and parents, but we have biblical accounts and stories. We have the people in our own lives. And then, of course, we have Jesus himself, who sets the ultimate example of how to overcome the world. And just a few statements here to kind of conclude this thought. We need others to follow, for us to follow, to come alongside, to pick us up, to push from behind, to chase us down, and to remind us that the victory over this world has already been won. There are times we need to be on the receiving end of that, and there are times we need to be on the giving end of that. We're the ones providing the encouragement for somebody else who's struggling, or they're providing it for us. Overcoming the world and strengthening the faith that is central to this only happens because of Jesus' victory, and only with the examples and encouragement of those around us. So that's where I went with this, was yes, we are called to overcome the world, and we're called to overcome the world because we're born of God, and because Jesus has already done it, and we follow in his victory. And it doesn't mean every single day it's easy, and it doesn't mean that every single day we feel like we have victory over the world, but that doesn't change the fact that the world has been overcome, and we get to be a part of that victory. And I think the greatest way that we do this is by walking through this world together. And my title was Overcoming Faith, which could kind of be read two different ways. But I think we're called to have a faith that overcomes, an overcoming faith. And I think it's important that we join each other as we walk out this overcoming faith together. Now, having talked about them a little bit, I think it's only appropriate that my little people and one grown-up person, they're going to join me here for the last couple minutes of our time together. So I don't have this down timed where like they are going to emerge because they are out walking around somewhere right now, but I will be back in just a moment with some of my little people. Well, as promised, here they are. They have returned from their walk. And Anna, did you want to tell them anything about your meetings that you've been having?
Can you wave? Can you wave?
How many would you say that you have a day? Make sure you talk so I can hear you.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
You have 9 meetings a day?
Yep.
Who are your meetings with?
1.
No, who are they with? Who are you talking to?
Mommy students.
All of Mommy's students. Yeah, it's been keeping you very busy. She often has meetings right when we tell her it's time to go to bed. And she'll be like, I have another meeting. So they're very conveniently scheduled. Anyway, so we just wanted to come together and say hi to you guys. And Asher wanted to show you something. Nice and hot.
Can you wave?
So Anna, what does this mean? What's the sign say?
This sign says there's a baby in Mommy's belly. Yep, and the due date is September.
So, yes, that is true. We are due with number 4.
Mommy and the baby.
We're due with
baby.
We're due with number 4 in September. Anything to say, Easton?
No.
No.
Do you want a baby?
Okay. All right. If you guys are quiet for a second, I'm just going to read for you our benediction. We'll pick Aaron's benediction since that makes sense. Do you want to read it?
Go ahead.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Say bye.
Bye.
See you soon.
See you soon.
Say bye.
Bye.